Hello everybody, this is Dr. Christopher White and welcome to the second part of the Mesozoic life history presentation. So in this presentation we are going to continue to look at the dinosaurs. We're going to spend some time looking at marine reptiles and flying reptiles, and then we're going to finish by looking at the evolution of the birds and the mammals. Alright, let's get going. So hopefully by now we are familiar with this diagram. So this is the cladogram for the clade Dinosauria. So the clade Dinosauria is split into two subgroups. We have the Saurischian dinosaurs and the Ornithischian dinosaurs. So the Saurischian dinosaurs essentially are often referred to as the lizard-hipped dinosaurs because their pelvic design is similar to that of modern-day reptiles. The Ornithischian dinosaurs are often referred to as the bird-hipped dinosaurs because their pelvic design is similar to that of modern-day birds. Now, the Saurischian dinosaurs are split into two subclades, the sauropods and the theropods. So the sauropods are a rather simple group of dinosaurs to identify. They are quadrupeds. On the whole, they are very, very large. They are all herbivores, and of course they all boast this long neck. Now, the theropod dinosaurs are a group of bipedal dinosaurs, so they walk exclusively on their hind legs. They are also almost all carnivores. Now, there are a few examples which were omnivores, and there were even a few very rare examples which appear to have been herbivores, but the vast majority of the theropod family were exclusively meat eaters. Now, the Ornithischian dinosaurs can be separated from the sauropods and the theropods quite easily because the five subclades of the Ornithischian dinosaurs all have bony beaks in the front of their mouth instead of front teeth. Now, these bony beaks are quite useful. They are primarily used for snipping off small pieces of vegetation. You have to remember, of course, the vegetation, especially during the Triassic and Jurassic, was mostly made up of seedless vascular plants and gymnosperms who have quite tough, robust leaves. So the first group of the Ornithischian dinosaurs are the ornithopods. Now, this is a group of herbivores. They are typically bipedal, although they have the capacity to walk on all four legs if they want to. Now, the most famous subgroup of the ornithopods are the hadrosaurs, who are often referred to as the duck-billed dinosaurs. So the next subclade are the pachycephalosaurs. This is a group of bipedal herbivores, and they can be distinguished by the fact they have a very overdeveloped dome on their skull. So it's a very thick layer of bone on the top of the head, and it would seem that this appears to have evolved primarily so that they could butt heads, probably during mating season, or maybe as some kind of attempt to work out who was going to be the alpha male or alpha female in their particular pack. Now, the next group are the ceratopsian dinosaurs. So this is the group that includes triceratops. So they are very stockily built quadrupeds. They are all herbivores, and of course most of them boast at least one horn on their face, typically three, and the vast majority of them have a bone frill which protects the top of the neck. Now, the next group are the stegosaurian dinosaurs. Once again, these are stockily built quadrupeds. They have either a row of spines or plates running down their back, and they will have a defensive structure at the end of their tail, which normally consists of at least two, but typically four spikes. The final subclade of the Ornithischian dinosaurs are the ankylosaurs. So once again, they're a group of quadrupedal, stocky herbivores. Now, they can be distinguished by the fact that they have armor. So they have armor on the top of their head, their neck, the top of their body, their sides, which are sometimes referred to as their flanks, all the way along their tail, and their tail terminates in a bony club. The bony club is going to be a defensive structure. And so, once again, they can be easily distinguished because they're the one group of dinosaurs that actually has, a large amount of body armor on them. Now, a set of recent studies from 2017 has actually indicated that the separation of the dinosaurs that we were just speaking about may not actually be correct. So the problem is that the cladogram that we were just looking at was based on a relatively limited fossil set from the late 19th and early 20th century. So of course since then we've been able to collect a substantial amount of additional data. Now, a recent very large study of dinosaur fossils focusing primarily on the hip bones has produced a very substantial change to the cladogram we were just looking at. So the change we're looking at is to do with the theropods. So the study seems to indicate that the theropod dinosaurs may not actually be part of the Saurischian dinosaurs, they may actually be part of the Ornithischian line. And this would suggest that the theropods should not be up here, but instead they should actually be located down here at the base of the Ornithischian family line. So what does this actually do? Well, by including theropods with the Ornithischian dinosaurs, it helps to get round a bit of a problem that we have, which is the evolution of birds. So by making the theropods part of the bird-hipped dinosaur line, it makes the evolution of birds far more straightforward, because remember, in the current position the theropods are part of the Saurischian line, so essentially they are lizard-hipped dinosaurs. And so this is a bit of a stretch to go from a lizard-hipped dinosaur to the evolution of a bird with a bird-like pelvis. Obviously that's quite a big evolutionary change. Whereas if the theropods are already part of the Ornithischian line, well, they already have the bird-like pelvis, and so the evolution of birds becomes just a little bit more straightforward. Now, there are some problems that do exist, however, and one of these is that the theropods are known for having mouths which are full of teeth. In contrast, the Ornithischian dinosaurs, well, yes, they do have teeth, but as we've already discussed, the front of their mouth doesn't have teeth, instead it has a bony beak. So you might notice a bit of a problem there, the theropods don't have a bony beak. So we get round this problem by saying, well, okay, chances are the theropods therefore must have broken off from the Ornithischian line quite early before the bony beak became a major evolutionary trait. And so that means the theropods have to be down here towards the base of the Ornithischian line rather than up here with the other 5 subclades. Now, the presence though of dinosaurs that have beaks within the Ornithischian line also then actually offers a possible explanation to the evolution of beaks within birds. And so by having the theropods as part of the Ornithischian line, it essentially says the genetic information required for beak development is already part of that line, and so the evolution of beaks by birds and the loss of teeth isn't a huge step, because that information is already there in the genetic makeup of the theropod group. So the new classification could also have a bit of an effect on the sauropods. So if we just go back for a second, if we move the theropods down here and make them part of the Ornithischian line, well then all of a sudden we have the theropods all by themselves. And then that does bring about the question of, well, as the theropods are now in their own little isolated subclade, does that technically mean they're dinosaurs anymore? So, you know, you could possibly end up with a situation where the theropods, the ornithopods, the pachycephalosaurs, the ceratopsians, the stegosaurians and the ankylosaurs are considered dinosaurs, whilst the sauropods are considered to be a completely separate group of dinosaur-like reptiles in their own right. So that's something that also needs to be considered, and of course, like any good debate, arguments have already started on the subject. So one of the things that we need to work out about dinosaurs is, were dinosaurs warm-blooded or cold-blooded? And obviously the thought that's gone straight through your head is, well, they're related to reptiles, they've got to be cold-blooded, haven't they? Well, the answer is yes and no. So the question we have to ask ourselves is, were dinosaurs endothermic, so that means warm-blooded, or ectothermic, that means cold-blooded? Now, recently, a body of evidence has begun to suggest that some dinosaurs may actually have been endotherms, they were warm-blooded. Now, there's 4 ways in which we can interpret this data. So we can interpret this data to say that, you know, based on the evidence we have, all dinosaurs were therefore endothermic. Now, that doesn't really work because the vast majority of the data we have relates to the ornithopods and the theropods. So this doesn't necessarily mean the pachycephalosaurs, the ceratopsians, the stegosaurians, the ankylosaurs, and the sauropods would therefore also be endothermic. So the second option is therefore, based on this evidence, some dinosaurs were endothermic, so some dinosaurs were warm-blooded. Well, that's a possibility. The third option is the ability to regulate metabolism changed with age. Most of the evidence we have appears to show that the indications of the animal having been warm-blooded are strongest when the animal is youngest. And so it may be that juvenile dinosaurs had the capacity to be endothermic in their juvenile stage, and as they moved to being a fully grown adult, maybe they moved to become ectothermic, so they became cold-blooded. Or the fourth possible option is that the data that we have is being misinterpreted, and so the conclusions we're drawing are incorrect, and in fact all dinosaurs were ectotherms. So what's the evidence that we have that's suggesting to us that dinosaurs may actually have been endothermic? So the first two pieces of evidence are to do with the dinosaur's bone. So the first part is the blood vessel density. So your bones aren't actually solid, they are full of holes, so they essentially look like honeycomb essentially. And all of these holes are present in your bone to allow small blood vessels to move in and out of your bone. So this obviously allows oxygen to be transported into the interior of your bone. Now, endothermic animals have numerous passageways within their bones, and that's because we have numerous blood vessels which are going into our bones whilst the animal is alive. Now, ectotherms also have these passageways, but they are typically present in much lower densities. Now, the reason for this is because endothermic animals, warm-blooded animals, obviously have a much higher oxygen requirement because our metabolism is a lot higher. This means that because we're metabolizing at a much faster rate, it means we are burning oxygen in a much faster rate, and so that means our body has to constantly be supplying our cells with a fresh supply of oxygen to keep them going. So in order to get around this problem, our bodies have essentially stuffed in as many blood vessels as is humanly possible so that they can get as much oxygen to our cells as fast as it can possibly be taken there. In contrast, ectothermic animals have a much slower metabolism, and so they have a much lower requirement for oxygen. And so this means essentially that their bodies can be designed a bit more simply, so they can have a reduced number of blood vessels because their cells aren't quite so oxygen dependent. They don't need a constant supply of oxygen coming in all the time. They can be a bit more relaxed about it, and so you don't need as many blood vessels. So that's the basic idea. Now, when we look at dinosaur bones, we see they have a blood vessel density which is very similar to modern endotherms, which would suggest it's an indication that they were warm-blooded. So great, job done, everyone can go home. No, unfortunately not. So the problem is that there are some reptiles, particularly the crocodiles and the turtles, that actually have bones that appear to be endothermic, even though we know these animals are actually ectotherms. So there are also some small animals that have bones that appear to be ectothermic, but as we know they're mammals, therefore they are warm-blooded. So blood vessel density data for bones has to be interpreted carefully. It's a hint that certain dinosaurs may have been warm-blooded, but it's not definitive. So the next piece of evidence once again focuses on the bones, and in this case it's focused on the growth lines that we see in the bones. So growth lines mark the yearly development of new bone as the dinosaur develops. So growth lines are going to be appearing as the dinosaur is growing up. Once it's an adult, these growth lines are going to stop forming. So a growth line is essentially comparable to a tree ring. Typically, a thin growth band would be interpreted as representing periods of slow bone growth, and a thick band would be reflected as the result of rapid bone development. So the theory is that although reptiles and mammals both have these growth lines in their bones, the thickness especially with regards to the blood vessel rich portion of the areas of the bone, will be different. So the model suggests that cold-blooded animals, so ectotherms, will essentially grow more slowly, so they will typically have thinner bands in their bone. In contrast, endotherms, so warm-blooded animals, because we have a higher metabolism, we will grow faster, we will add new mass to our bones faster, and so we will tend to have much thicker growth bands in our bones. So what do we see? Well, when we look at dinosaur bones, and here is a Tyrannosaurus rex bone right here, you can quite clearly make out these big, chunky growth bands in the bone. And this would suggest that as this Tyrannosaurus rex was growing up, especially also during its juvenile stage, it was adding mass to its bones very, very quickly. And so this is another piece of evidence that hints at the possibility that certain dinosaurs may well have been warm-blooded. But once again, is it definitive? No, it's not definitive. It's not a solid enough piece of evidence to definitively say some dinosaurs were definitely warm-blooded. So the next piece of evidence is an important one, and this is percentage of the population. So as endothermic predators, so warm-blooded predators, burn so much energy, they obviously need to eat a lot to replenish the energy that's been used up. So what you need is, in order for an endothermic predator to survive, it obviously needs lots of prey to feed off. And so this means that the ratio of prey to predator is going to be quite low. So you're going to have very few predators and lots of prey. Now, in contrast, ectothermic predators, so something like a crocodile, for instance, has a much slower metabolism, and so they require less food. And so this means that when we look at the population breakdown, we'll be able to see a distinct difference between communities which have lots of endothermic predators and communities that have lots of ectothermic predators. So in these endothermic communities, we see that the warm-blooded predators will only make up a few % of the total population of animals. In contrast, the ectothermic predators, the cold-blooded predators, can make anywhere up to 50% of the total population because they don't require anywhere near as much prey. So when we look at dinosaur populations, what do we see? Well, for the few places where we do have reasonably good dinosaur population data, the predators that we can find make up about 3 to 5% of the total dinosaur population. This would suggest, based on that piece of evidence, that they would be endothermic because you have very few predators and lots of prey. However, we need to be careful. There are uncertainties within these data sets. So, we have very few data areas where we have a good enough snapshot of the dinosaur population to actually say, what percentage of the population were predators. And even in those situations, we can't actually be certain that what we're looking at is a representative sample. So it could be, for instance, that the sample we're looking at just happens to have formed, let's say, when there was a flash flood, and that flash flood happens to have washed away a load of herbivores. However, at the same time, it only washed away a very small number of carnivores. And so it makes it look like the carnivores were a low percentage, when in reality, it's just a sampling bias. So we need to be careful. So yes, this is a pretty decent piece of evidence to suggest that certain dinosaurs, especially the carnivorous dinosaurs, the theropods, might have been warm-blooded. So the next possible piece of evidence is brain size. So a large brain compared to body size requires a constant body temperature. So endotherms tend to have larger brains for their body size because we can regulate them a little bit better. Now, a human brain is approximately 2% of our body mass, but it actually uses up about 20% of all the body's energy budget. So big brains are amazingly energy intensive things. So this means lower energy organisms, so the cold-blooded organisms, the ectotherms, will often have smaller brains as their metabolism is unable to supply the required amount of energy. So being warm-blooded, we have a high metabolism, our body can create and burn through quite large quantities of energy quite quickly, and so we have the capacity to maintain quite a large brain. So when we look at the small to medium theropod dinosaurs, one thing we notice is they have a very high brain size to body size ratio. Their brains are very large when you compare it to their bodies. And so this is another indicator that might suggest that these small to medium theropod dinosaurs were warm-blooded, because the brain size would suggest that, you know, they have a very high energy requirement, and so being warm-blooded would help them to satisfy that need. So another factor is that these small to medium theropod dinosaurs that we're talking about is the group essentially that gives rise to the birds, and the birds are of course warm-blooded and covered in feathers. So this would be another piece of evidence to suggest that, yeah, these small to medium theropods may well have been warm-blooded. So the next factor which suggests that dinosaurs might have been warm-blooded is growth rates. So measurements of juvenile duck-billed dinosaurs, so that's the hadrosaurs, if you remember the hadrosaurs are part of the subclade Ornithopodia, we can see that these juvenile duck-billed dinosaurs grew very fast. So once again, if you're cold-blooded, you have a slower metabolism, it typically means you will add less mass to you'll add mass to your body more slowly. Your bones will grow more slowly, your muscles will develop more slowly, etc. Now, in contrast, if you are warm-blooded, you have a higher metabolism, that means your body essentially will be burning through energy very, very quickly, but it will be using that energy to make new bone, new muscle, etc. And so this means that warm-blooded animals will typically grow faster than cold-blooded animals. And so when we look at the data that we have for juvenile duck-billed dinosaurs, it would seem to suggest that they grew very fast, faster than we would expect if they had been cold-blooded. And so this is another piece of evidence that suggests that maybe these duck-billed dinosaurs, these ornithopods, were warm-blooded. Once again, though, the counter-argument to that is, well, we only have a few sites where we have large numbers of juvenile dinosaurs that have been fossilized, and then we have to ask ourselves once again, are these sites for which we have data representative, or are they merely sites which are giving us a skewed appearance because there's some other factor operating that we don't understand? The final piece of evidence that suggests that dinosaurs might have been warm-blooded is heart design. So in 2000, a fossilized duck-billed dinosaur was found, and it had a fully intact fossilized heart. So they could take the fossil, they could put it into an MRI scanner, and essentially they could produce a three-dimensional model of the fossilized heart. So when they produced that model, what they found out was that the heart in question had 4 chambers in it. So mammals, birds, and crocodiles have 4 chambers. Most reptiles, on the other hand, and amphibians have 3 chambers. So that's a pretty significant difference. So the more advanced heart design, so this 4-chambered heart, is essentially required because it allows oxygenated blood to be more efficiently distributed throughout the body. And of course this is important for warm-blooded animals because we have this high metabolism. Our cells have a very high need for oxygen, and so we need to get as much oxygen to them as fast as possible, and so having a 4-chambered heart is one of the ways in which our body manages to do this. Now, the one thing I will say is that it's not just the birds and mammals that have a 4-chambered heart, it's also the crocodiles as well. And so we need to bear that in mind because dinosaurs and crocodiles are related to each other, and so, you know, the fact that we have this 4-chambered heart doesn't necessarily mean that it's a 100% solid piece of evidence that what we're looking at is a warm-blooded animal. So, although we lack a conclusive piece of evidence, the combined evidence for theropods and ornithopods being warm-blooded is actually quite strong. So, I think we can agree, although there's no, one piece of evidence that definitively says, yes, they were warm-blooded, we actually have quite a few pieces of evidence to suggest that the theropods and the ornithopods may well have been warm-blooded. Now, in terms of the sauropod dinosaurs, we know with a pretty high degree of certainty that they were cold-blooded. However, their large size meant they probably generated their own heat, and this is a process called gigantothermism. So now let's move on to the flying reptiles. So the pterosaurs were the first land vertebrates to achieve flight. So we need to remember that insects were actually there first, so the insects managed to achieve flight all the way back in the Paleozoic. In terms of vertebrates, they don't achieve flight until the Mesozoic. So the pterosaurs were common in the skies of the Mesozoic between the late Triassic and the late Cretaceous. They were a very successful group. So pterosaurs had three major adaptations which allowed them to fly. So the first adaptation is hollow bones. Essentially, the lighter your skeleton, the more easy it is to fly, and so the bones of the pterosaurs are hollow to save on weight. We also see that when we look at the skulls and we scan the skulls, we can see that their brains appear to have had large regions which would have probably been there to coordinate muscle control and sight. And of course, this is very, very important. So, if you're a flying reptile, so you're actively hunting, well, obviously you need to have very good muscle coordination so you can, get yourself into the correct position to catch whatever prey you're going after. And obviously you need very good sight to be able to see the prey in the first place. The final adaptation that they have is a very elongated fourth finger. So if we look at this skeleton here, you can quite clearly see the elongated forefinger. It's this part sticking out right here, and there it is again right there, and you can even see it in this skeleton here. There's the elongated forefinger there, and here's the elongated forefinger here. And so the elongated forefinger is there to operate essentially as a bone support for the wing membrane. So without that fourth finger being there, essentially the wing membrane would not be rigid, and so obviously that would be a major issue if you were trying to fly. So having that elongated forefinger is essential. So the evolution history of the pterosaurs is pretty terrible in the grand scale of things. So we know they're descended from the archosaurs, so we know they're descended from the same line as the dinosaurs and the crocodiles, but the exact path of how we get to the pterosaurs is actually uncertain, and there's a couple of reasons for this. Number one, the pterosaurs are very often going to be living in environments that have a very slow rate of sedimentation. So if a pterosaur dies and its body hits the ground, it's not going to be rapidly covered over by sediment, so that means obviously it's less likely to fossilize. The other problem is that, as we've discussed, the pterosaurs have hollow bones, which on the whole are weaker than regular bones. And so this means the skeleton that is obviously going to be incorporated into the sediment as part of the fossilization process is therefore going to be less likely to survive that fossilization process because it's so flimsy. And so this obviously means that the fossil record for these pterosaurs is pretty rubbish. So here are a few fun facts about the pterosaurs. Number one, they are not the ancestors of birds. The vast majority of them were no larger than sparrows, robins, crows, that kind of size. They were pretty small, although the largest one had a wingspan of about 12 meters. So these smaller pterosaurs would have been able to operate like birds, so they would have been able to flap their wings in order to achieve lift. Now, in contrast, the larger pterosaurs would not have been able to flap their wings. If they had tried to flap their wings, the sheer weight of the wing would actually have ended up breaking the bones in their arms. And so it looks like these larger pterosaurs were probably gliders. Think of them like an albatross. Essentially, they would use thermals in the atmosphere in order to push them higher in the atmosphere, and then they would just simply drop down and scoop up their prey as they descended. Now, when we look at the bones of these larger pterosaurs, as I was saying, they are too weak to actually flap the wings, and so this means they must have been gliders. From what we can see, the pterosaurs laid soft-shelled eggs, a bit like turtles. There is at least one example of a pterosaur where we can definitely see a coat of hair or hair-like feathers on the body, and these are likely there for temperature control. And the final thing is, given how much energy is actually required to fly, it's not beyond the realm of possibility that pterosaurs were actually warm-blooded, because once again, if you're warm-blooded, you have that high metabolism, and so you have the capacity to burn large amounts of energy very, very quickly. Okay, so this is a good place to stop part 1. So get up, have a walk around, go and get a glass of water, sit down for 5 or 10 minutes to relax, and then please come back for part 2.